Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be working on a Audi A7. Now this A7 has a third generation 3 litre TDI engine inside, and the plan for today is to remove the engine and replace the timing chains. Apart from all of the oil that's leaking out from the engine, there's nothing necessarily wrong with the car, but the owner wants to remove the engine, replace the chains and have a general look over and see what needs to be replaced, as this car is coming up to 220,000 miles on the clock, so pretty well driven. So as I'm sure as you can imagine, before you can remove the engine you need to disconnect loads and loads and loads of things like fuel pipes, coolant pipes, AdBlue pipes, boost hoses, wiring, loads and loads of wiring, especially on this car, suspension, prop shaft, exhaust, the list just goes on and on and on. But the best way to not get overwhelmed and to be as efficient as possible is to think of the car being in 3 stages, where it's first on the ground level and then you move it up on the ramp a little bit and then you move it higher. It just saves you having to send the car up and down 5 million times. So with the coolant bottle coming out the way, we can have a closer look at the rocker covers, and as you can see they are leaking pretty badly, and this is quite common on the 3 litres. The seals just go old and hard and just don't hold oil anymore. Same with the injector seals as well. So with everything inside the engine bay is disconnected, I can send the car up a little bit, remove the wheels and start taking the arch linings off. And behind the arch linings there's a couple grounding points and the wiring that goes to the alternator and starter. They need to be unclipped from the chassis so that when you remove the engine you don't rip it off. So the best way that I've found to remove this engine is to remove the anti-roll bar, power steering rack, and then remove the suspension arms away from the subframe. So then that way you can leave the whole knuckle connected to the chassis and you don't have to mess around with any of the brakes. That's what I've been fighting, the gear linkage. Oh yeah. Exhaust is off. Gear linkage is off. AdBlue is off. Arms, camshaft. This coolant hose. This pipe, water pipe, leaking on me. AC also off. It's a real mess. Messy. Really messy. So now that absolutely everything has been disconnected, I can start removing the subframe bolts and separating the chassis away from the engine. If I remember correctly, there wasn't much space between the engine and the radiators in the front, so it was a bit of a pain to remove the prop shaft, but I found that if you unbolt the center bearing for the prop, it drops down a little bit, and as you're sending the car up on the ramp, and if you get it at the right angle, you can push the engine forward and slide the prop off. So it wasn't too bad, just a bit fiddly. But now that the engine's out, I can start removing the exhaust, subframe and separating the gearbox away from the engine. But unfortunately I didn't manage to record too much of this because my phone ended up dying, so very sorry, but it is what it is. So here we are the next day with my phone fully charged and ready to film. We're going to start by removing all of the wiring that's on top so that we can remove the inlet manifold, turbo and EGR. Now this engine is quite it's not really well engineered, designed, not really well put together, because most things that you need to remove, you have to remove a bunch of other things so that you can remove the one thing that you do need to remove. So this engine is quite frustrating to work with in a sense, but with that being said, it was still a lot easier to strip it all down than to put it back together later. So if you own a 3 litre TDI, this is most likely how your intake manifold and intake valves look. They will look very carboned up and nasty, not ideal for airflow whatsoever, but that's what happens when you have an EGR system, unfortunately. And last time I cleaned one of these intakes and valves, I spent a good 6 to 8 hours, so pretty much a whole day cleaning just the inlet valves, so very labour intensive. But we do offer a service where we hook up a cleaning machine to the intake pipe, and whilst the engine is running, this sprays a BG cleaning chemical, and this cleans the manifold and valves at the same time. And to be honest, it's just as good as taking the manifold off and cleaning the valves manually with a walnut blaster, for example. So if you do own a 3 litre TDI, I would definitely consider getting this kind of service done to avoid having clogged up intake valves and a completely carboned up intake manifold. This is an example of the excellent engineering and thought process gone into designing these cars. So to replace the chains, you need to remove the turbo, but to remove the turbo, you first need to remove the intake manifold, and then once the manifold's off, you find out that there's a plate bolted to the rear cover that needs to be removed before you can take it off. And to remove that cover, you need to remove the EGR. All of these extra things need to be removed just so you can remove the rear timing cover. But I guess in a way it's good because it revealed a couple oil leaks and coolant leaks that were hiding in the middle of the V. So good or bad, you decide. The little bit of play that I was showing you in the timing chain on that one guide, that's all caused by the chain tensioner, which is to be expected because there's no oil pressure inside it, but realistically it shouldn't be losing pressure that quickly. So that's why in the morning when you first start your car up you can hear a little bit of rattling coming from the engine, and that's just basically the chain slapping against the guides before it builds up oil pressure. And if you ignore that little rattling for a little bit too long, then the plastic guides will eventually start to crack and break down. And then one morning you might end up with no oil pressure because the oil pump strainer will be blocked with bits of plastic guide. A little bit of time has passed and I've cleaned all of the surface where the silicone will be applied, and now I will begin cleaning all of the covers ready to be refitted. All of these covers and that as well.
Somebody help me.
So the first set of chains and guides are on, and these are for the high pressure fuel pump. The three T30s on the left get torqued to 5 Newton meters plus 90 degrees, and the single one on the right is 5 plus 45 degrees. And now I can move on to fitting the one big chain that drives both of the camshaft sprockets. So with everything together, we can pull the grenade pin out, and we can spin the engine a couple times to make sure everything lines back up where it should. And now begins the not so fun part of trying to remember where everything goes. So first I'm going to start by putting back all of the rear covers, putting new seals where there needs to be a new seal, and adding plenty of silicone. Then we're going to move on to the rear main seal, and then the rocker covers, they will also be getting new seals, and the injectors also will be getting new copper washers and the 2 O-rings that need to be replaced on them. And then after I've kind of put it back together, we're going to end up stripping it down a little bit further because the customer has agreed to replace everything inside of the V. So that's including the oil cooler, and there's also 2 water flanges in there that are also leaking. And we're also going to be doing the front cover reseal. So that's going to involve removing the cover, cleaning it, and replacing the gasket that's behind there because that's leaking some oil. And then we're also going to be putting a new water pump and a whole new oil filter housing, because you can't just buy a seal separately. You need to buy a whole new housing for £300, because why not? And we're also going to be replacing the thermostat that's attached to that front cover as well. New injector seals. One down like so. New. You get the point. All cooler's coming off, this will be resealed. New valve. here we are. All the stuff on the front is on. It's all clean. In the middle is nice and clean. I spent a while getting all the dirt, oily dirt out. A new valve, flange, oil cooler's been resealed. This has been resealed. This is new. This is new. Gearbox is on. Next thing will be put the turbo on. EGR cooler, EGR valve on there. Then we can put the manifold back on. And then we can get the subframe on. The subframe, I've put the new engine mounts in. Very nice. So let's get to it. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you. I hope you've been enjoying it. But now that 90% of the car is back together, all that's left to do is put back some of the wiring. The fuel lines need to be put back on, the coolant bottle also, and then I can get the fresh oil, coolant back into the engine, and then we can spin the engine over through the starter. And the reason we do this is so that the engine has time to build up oil pressure, so that when we start it for the first time it doesn't just rattle for no reason and potentially cause unnecessary wear to the parts that we just fitted. So that about does it for this video. I hope you found it interesting or maybe helpful, and if you're curious about the total bill, it was in the region of around £9,000. So if you are looking at buying one of these cars, do keep in mind that you might have to put in an extra couple pounds to have it in a good condition where you can jump in the morning and drive it wherever your heart desires, and you won't be stranded on the side of the road waiting for a recovery truck. Anyway, drive safe, and I'll see you in the next one.